Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Well, we can't see the audience with the lights, but we'll assume they're out there because we were just there. So I just got in 6 minutes ago from San Francisco. It's great to be here. My driver, I thought, was getting me to the right place through all the back roads, and we did make it. So we're going to have some fun here. We're going after, I don't like following the big guys we just followed, but we're going to go for it. Why don't we just start here, and why don't we, I'm going to ask Howard, you start. Why don't you introduce your fund, yourself and the fund, and then we'll just sort of dive into our topic, if you will, and have a nice conversation.
Sure. Howard Morgan, back in 2004, Josh Koppelman and I started First Round Capital. And at the time we started, I was 59, 60 years old, and I said to Josh, I'll do this for 10 years. You know, and then we have to figure out a way to transition and bring in new blood and keep this going in this early stage. And so generational planning started right at the beginning, but I've recently stepped back, so I am now co-founder and special advisor to First Round starting in April, and took on the role as chairman of B Capital Partners, a later stage fund based in Singapore and LA. So while I'm helping with generational transition at one fund, I'm helping to start another one, which I'm also told that they have to, I've told them also they have to plan for this in the next 10 years.
I love it, exactly. Dick?
Yeah, talk about intergenerational. Tim Draper is the third of fourth generations in his entire family. In fact, his father, Bill Draper, is a director of our management company. We have 4 outside directors, and he's one of them. And my first secretary when we started NEA in 1978 was General Draper's secretary. And so I have a lot of insights into the Draper family, and what he's had to say was very inspirational in many ways. But in case of, I moved out from Boston to San Francisco in '69, joined Arthur Rock, and Arthur and I were partners for 6 years, actually. And we officed together in '77. We started NEA in '78, or late '77, early '78, and we now have 16 funds and about $20 billion in US dollars denomination. It might be bitcoins in the future, and but anyway, I'm open-minded to change, but that's what we're doing.
Dick and Howard, thank you. So I'm Victor Boyajian. I lead the global practice for Dentons. I have I'm in New York and San Francisco, and I have the great privilege of sitting on top of what we're doing globally. So we see what's going on in Berlin with funds and strategics. We see what's going on in London. Tim mentioned Singapore, China, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a great vantage point. And I think part of the conversation we want to have here is to try to help the audience draw some insights as they start funds, whether they're in nascent markets or you're in a more established market, quite frankly, and then talk about the issues we're talking about. And we can take the conversation anywhere we want, which is what we're going to do anyway. But let me just jump off on some of the points we just talked about in terms of, how, actually you both talked about it. Howard, you said, one of the first things out of your mouth when you sat down with Josh was that we got a plan for the future, basically. And no different than many of your portfolio companies, where you think about succession planning, certainly as you move into the later stage, and I suppose even early stage. What did prompt that thinking on your part? Well, no one thinks that far out other than the next day.
Well, first of all, I think if you're a successful venture capitalist, you are thinking 5 or 10 years out. You are thinking the way Tim talked about what could happen with cryptocurrencies over the next decade. And that's the way I wanted to think. And I'd also seen over the course of my previous sort of 25 years in the venture world, a number of firms sort of rise and fall because they hadn't done a good job of succession planning. They hadn't thought it through early on, or they changed completely. Alan Patrikoff in New York, an amazing guy, built what became Apex Partners, and it sort of got away from him, right? And the style drift happens too quickly. If you let yourself raise too much money, and Tim talked about raising too much money hurting actual venture companies, but it also hurts the venture capital firms too, because they tend to then drift. We want to do early stage investments at First Round. That's what we know how to do. If we raised $1 billion fund, you can't do the same level of early stage investments and support. So we wanted to think about how do we keep this firm culture going? And that means bringing new people in. And that's what we started from the very beginning. And as we brought in other partners, and we started to plan, particularly sort of 5 years ago, a lot about, okay, now what are we going to do with New York? What are we going to do with our different offices? How do we bring new people in? And frankly, how do we have enough carried interest to give them so that they're incented? And the only way to do that is for the older generation to give up some of that to the newer generation. And that's not an easy thing to do. And so some people hold on too long.
So, Dick, again, there's notion of folks holding on too long. I just want to pull back just one step and jump off what Howard was mentioning. Is this sort of, is the issue really about protecting the firm and just on your own thoughts, or are you getting pressure from the LPs initially, where the LPs are saying, we want to understand where you're heading. Give us some insights. We love you. You got a great track record. You got a super brand as a fund, as individuals. You've all worked together. You got great exits, but we got to see where you're going and where you're going to be in 10 years.
Well, there are a couple of angles to this, obviously. And I take a little bit of an issue with Tim about the role of a VC. I consider myself an entrepreneur, not a financier. And I think that our job is to synthesize a lot of different elements that are coming along, both in terms of technology and life sciences. We do about 60% technology, 40% life sciences. But our job is really to be an informed advisor and collaborator along with the entrepreneurs in building the very best companies that you can build over a long period of time. And we started out with an attitude at NEA of being very LP friendly. And the idea is that LPs were our partners. And what we wanted to do was we said we wanted to keep our fees very low because we're repaying the LPs our fees. And so therefore we had a common goal alignment. Goal alignment is the name of the game. And so we wanted to be goal aligned with them and also be a party to collectively and individually having the best possible performance that would make it very feasible for the LPs to stay engaged. I mean, if you're going to raise a fund every couple of 3 years, how are you going to ensure the fact that if you raise 3 funds in 10 years, that the partners who are going to be engaged and responsible for taking those funds and putting them to work are going to be the same in year 10 as they were in year 1. There's a lot of turnover in this business, and I think our job was to really build something that we could be proud of over the long term. So we're about ready to have our 40th anniversary, and we've rejuvenated the firm every step along the way. The way we started, I think there are 2 answers to your question. One is philosophical and the other is practical. I think philosophically, I think you have to say, all right, look, we're going to put ourselves in this position of trying to engage and doing the most important, being party to the most important transitions that are going on, and it doesn't cease today. I mean, it's, if anything, more exciting today. I consider where we are as on the threshold of the real application of the industrial internet. I think what we've done up to now is social media in terms of amplifying the value of the internet. And now I think we're going to talk about gross domestic product and the other 80% that's only had a 10% increase in productivity. I think we're going to jump that to 40, 50 or greater percentage as we learn how to apply that technology. But the point is, in order to do any of these things, you have to have a longevity of your intellect and how you apply this over a period of time and experience. So we started out by being equal partners. And I was a Lone Ranger on the West Coast. I had 2 partners on the East Coast. We were the first firm that started with offices on both coasts. And we handled that way, and we needed to have sort of a regimen in order to make our decisions, replicable and take value from what we learned to date. And without going into the whole thing, so I was a managing partner for the first 20 years, and we returned 41.4% net to the limited partners over that 20-year period per year. And so another thing that buffooned a lot of people, is as we put more money to work, our returns got higher, not smaller. And most of the common thinking is that smaller is better. Well, I'm not saying nothing is better other than performance. And it doesn't. And then what your job is to learn how to develop and work with different levels of pools of capital, and then make them productive and up to date on the current technology. So that's what we've continued to do and made changes all the way along the way. And then we went into the second generation, shifted the leadership to the East Coast, and now we're in the third generation. Back on the West Coast, Scott Sandell is a managing partner. And
Is that a coincidental sort of back and forth, or is that
sort of
design?
semi-coincidental, as I said. It's practical and
Yeah.
philosophical at the same time. You don't want to have any part of your team not feel as though they're engaged in it full scale. And to do that, you can't, say I'm a West Coast firm or I'm an East Coast firm. There are good things that happen in both levels. I moved from Boston to San Francisco, and Tim was right. It was around 128 that this whole thing really started in the United States. And I could see that if you wanted to really take massive jumps, rather than do them a little bit at a time, the place to do it was Silicon Valley. So that's why I said.
Let me ask you both this. You raised some really interesting points. You talk about the 128 corridor, and right now you're seeing a shift from the 128 corridor into Cambridge. You're seeing, the valley into San Francisco, the suburbs of New York.
Still good stuff going on in Boston.
I'm sorry?
Still good stuff going on in Boston, particularly life sciences.
Absolutely. Not to disparage it. But again, some of that, as I talk to my friends in the industry, are prompted by the next generation, however you describe that. And I think the wisdom of leadership is to sort of let that go.
Yeah.
Howard, you used the phrase, though, be careful not to lose control, not of the leadership, but just of where you're going.
Well, of where you're
How
going,
do you do
and
that?
the culture, you have got to build a culture that is a multi-location culture. So when the first year at First Round, Josh and I made 48 trips to California. We were based in Philadelphia. And we realized that, as these guys had earlier, that we needed to have an office in the Bay Area. So we found partners in the Bay Area. And then we had to build a culture that made the decision-making truly distributed so that everybody participated in decisions, whether it was a New York company, a Philly company, an LA company, or a San Francisco company. And that meant learning how to use video conferencing, which was pretty awful 12 years ago. It's gotten a lot better today. Learning how to create voting structures and decision structures that allowed all of the partners to truly contribute their opinions without being biased by what the East Coast thought or the West Coast thought. And we developed all of those systems, which allowed us to then bring in more partners over time and socialize them into our system of doing things. And that's how you get generational transition. If you have a systematic culture that you bring someone in and they join into that culture, they fit that culture, then the individuals, I won't say they don't matter as much because you want great people obviously doing it, but they can continue that culture. And at First Round, as Dick said, and I kind of agree, we're not just financiers. We built our platform to help, and a 30-person team to help companies grow. That's an important part of the First Round culture. Doing the same thing at B Capital, building a platform team.
So you guys make it sound really easy. So when I was a couple of years ago talking to some of my friends, I won't, of course, name the fund. I guess I shouldn't. And I was talking to the younger guys, and the fund had a great rhythm going. They were doing great stuff, but they were pretty much investing in their, area. And it wasn't the valley, but within an hour of their headquarters, I'll say. And the next generation, the younger generation coming in, really wanted to chase sector. They didn't want to focus on geography. They didn't want to be the fund to go to in city X. They wanted to be the sector expert. And there was a press to that. And so whether they were going to Austin or Boston or San Diego or LA, wherever.
Seattle.
Pardon?
Seattle.
Seattle, exactly. They wanted to go there.
Right.
Well, they started locking horns with the senior leadership because the senior leadership said, hey, it's working. The LPs like what we're doing.
Well,
and
that's
wasn't
one thing
inspiring
that
to the younger
Howard
guys.
referred to. I mean, you can't look at just today. You always have to look 10 years down the road. and try to sense out where we're going in all these very intricate technologies, and have the experience and the wisdom to understand it when you see it.
So how do you react to the scenario I just sort of laid out, because it's a real scenario where, again, it's working and you're getting pressure from the young.
What happens, and we saw this happen in the Valley in the late 90s, is funds split, right? I mean, you have funds split over that thing. You have other funds created. So
Is there a way to manage it before it splits? Because I want to talk about funds splitting in a second.
Is there a way to manage it before it splits? If in fact there's that much tension, probably not. Probably not. You have to look at the reality. Because either the senior leadership is willing to learn about the future, and then people are saying, okay, there's great stuff happening in life sciences, there's great stuff happening in Seattle or in LA, or they're not. And if they were not, then the younger generation was going to be unhappy and leave anyway. So I think you need to bring in people who fit the culture that you've built. And you need to be able to listen to them when they say, gee, we should be. So First Round didn't do a lot of healthcare early on, and started, as we brought in some partners, they said, we should be looking at some of these deals. And we started putting our toe in the water and listening to them and doing more deals in the health IT space, which became, obviously, it's a huge piece of the economy of the world and became more and more important. But I think you see firms split when that happens.
I think there's a lot that has to do with decision making, and you said in the example you were using, they ran into this backwater of the senior guys saying that they didn't believe in what they were being proposed. The point is that you have to have always have a transitional nature to what you're doing. And if you're going to really build a multi-generational firm that isn't family-oriented, and I like the way Tim's family has handled it, by the way, but if you're going to do the more or less institutional approach, you really have to have a dynamic decision-making process. And it can't, I remember back before we had actually vision-based systems to communicate, and you were just doing it, and I said, I know what Frank Bonsall looks like. We could do it by telephone, and it all worked out perfectly. And then we just adopted every new technology that came along to try to improve our batting average all the time. But it really has to do with, I asked Howard how they made decisions, and he said that they have to have 6 out of 7, I think you said, or 5 out of 6.
Something like
5 out of 6, something like that. I certainly agree with, you have to have dynamic rules that treat reality the way it is today. That's why we didn't have any names in our company in the beginning, and that's why you didn't either. And we share that. I think so we always try to yield to the next best good idea and change the management accordingly. And so one thing that we did that was lucky happened in year 2000 when we were going through the big meltdown. We were just raising our first $1 billion fund with $2.3 billion, and everybody was turning back, half of their fund because, how are you going to invest this and all? That's just exactly 180 out of sync. That's the time when times are bad is when you should raise money and when you should invest it. At any rate, we were one of only a few firms that didn't do that. We raised 2.3, and everybody said, "Well, Dick, obviously you're going to turn half of that back, right?" And I said, "No." They said, "Well, how come?" And I said, "Well, I have a secret." People said, "You have a secret? What's the secret?" And I said, "Well, if I told you, it wouldn't be a secret." But actually, what we had just done is ramped up our life science fund. Now, life sciences is a very, very specific place to invest money. And you do it, though, with milestone-based financings, which is what we don't have the benefit of in technology a lot. But everything in life sciences is based upon the FDA and the milestones that you're expecting to gain on that. But the point was that I had in mind that we had just ramped up. We were going to put 40% of that $2.3 billion into life sciences. And so I had a very clear idea personally, and I think our partners shared this idea of where we could be productive with that. It was a very productive fund. And so you have to be willing to adjust your thinking to that, to what it is you have responsibility for.
So let me jump off on that. We have a global crowd here. Again, as I said at the outset, some are nascent funds, some are quite established, some are on the strategic side and corporates. Again, global sector expertise and sector specialization is a trend. Globalization, big trend. Obviously, 40 years ago, it was all about the Valley, and look at the stats, and I forget what the numbers are.
128.
Yeah.
And yes, thank you, supporting the 128 corridor. But there's been a shift. There's a paradigm shift, and part of that is about sector expertise and the realization that you can have great talent and thinking and ideas elsewhere, beyond the U.S., of course. So I guess the question again is, how do you, again, just taking our discussion to the next level, deal with that globalization issue? Because just like your portfolio companies, it's extraordinarily difficult to manage something where you got both coasts, let alone across the pond or Pacific.
To be clear, at B Capital, I was on a call last week which was at 10 a.m. Eastern time with someone in London, someone in LA, someone in Singapore. So Singapore was 10
Welcome to my world,
p.m.
right?
10 p.m. So you have to deal with that. You have to deal with the decision-making rules. And first round's changed over the years in terms of what percentages we want in order to approve deals. But we've looked very carefully at our statistics as to how things are succeeding in terms of that. But I think you do have to understand globalization. You do have to understand that there's 600-700 million people in Indonesia and Malaysia with smartphones, as Tim pointed out, and that's a gigantic market that completely U.S.-centric firms are ignoring. And if they ignore it at their peril, right? Because good ideas are happening everywhere in the world. But that said, it is still true that much of the innovation is still started in the U.S. Just because we allow for failure, and that allowing for failure means people can succeed again, try again and succeed.
Well, the way we dealt with that was I was trying to get some of the younger people to move over to China, and for good, solid reasons, educational preferences and stuff like that, nobody would do it. So my wife said, well, why don't we do it? So I said, good idea. And so we moved to China. We moved to Shanghai. And I'd been going over there since the 80s and trying to figure out when was the time. And there was a good period of time, a decade or decade and a half of time, it was really good to be in China. And I do agree it's changing a lot. But I didn't think actually we found out we made a lot of decent investments over that period of time by living there. And the only way to really understand something is to be there on the ground. You can't fly in, fly out. There were a lot of people flying in, flying out. I mean, I think that Sequoia's done a good job by picking their right partner they had there, actually. But in any event, I think there are a number of thresholds that you have to cross in order to live there full time. That's what we found out was valuable.
And just a side note here, the China, I'll call it strategy, or the initial seed for China, your fund.
Right.
Did that come from above, or was it from the next generation? Not everything has to be intergenerational
Yeah.
or driven by conflict, but I'm just curious as to.
Well, we had a lot of Asians in our firm, and so it came from across the board, age-wise and gender-wise and locational-wise, where their origins were. So it was really multifaceted, and people always said, look, there must be a better way.
Yeah. How are we going to?
Well, first round only invests in the U.S. pretty much, but I do think one of the changes we're seeing for the better in firms is the increasing diversity, both gender diversity and underrepresented minorities coming in, which open up new networks of entrepreneurs, but also contributes a different voice in the decision making. And that's an important thing as you move from generation to generation, is to hear the new voices, to hear what the different generations feel about changes in both technology and how society can adapt and use them.
Mm-hmm. So let me just pivot back to where, to one point we were talking about, which is sort of the split. Mm-hmm. And again, we don't want to suggest that all conflict ends in splits, or that all a good discussion results in conflict or is about conflict. But if you get to the point where strategically folks are not aligned, to use your word, how does that sort of give us a little flavor, sort of the end story there?
Well, I
Because
guess
it's not easy just to split. I mean, everyone has vested interests in the history of the fund and the legacy.
it's not easy. I guess we got I guess August and Benchmark came out of an earlier fund, which couldn't get through the conflict situations. You see other funds when IVP. You see a lot of technology venture investors that Dave Marquardt. You see a lot of change, particularly in that 2000 period when hundreds of funds could not raise their next fund. Partly because the endowments were cutting back because they had to. If you have a 5% allocation to venture and your whole endowment's cut in half, your amount going to venture is cut in half. And so a lot of funds just didn't get re-upped. And that was a problem for many funds. But you also had the tensions if a fund was going to be raising a smaller fund, how many partners could you have and so on. And I think that caused splits, and it still can cause splits in companies. You see a lot of the new sort of seed, and particularly in the seed stage where first round is, you see a lot of people either leaving a fund or trying to find another partner to be able to do their own seed stage fund because they feel they can do well with a much smaller fund than was needed. If you want to do life sciences, you need hundreds of millions or billions. If you want to do ICOs, you don't need nearly that much money. So people think they can do really well with small funds.
So I could add a little something here on the area of structure, because I think structure has a lot to do with it. And at that time, we raised in EA10, the $2.3 billion. We really took an internal look and said, what is the situation? I was actually provoked into thinking about this by what happened with Vinod Khosla, why he left Kleiner. Right. I said, Vinod's a smart guy, and why is he leaving Kleiner? I know there are a lot of politics and things like that, and it's a good firm, and but the answer is that there was nothing to keep him there. And as you go through the realities of what it is to run a venture firm, you realize, for the most part, venture firms lurch from fund to fund. And if somebody thinks they're the smartest guy in the room or the smartest girl in the room, they may want to leave and do their own thing. So there's nothing wrong with that. I think people ought to be where they should be or where they want to be, and leave that decision to the individual. But so what we did is we were talking with our LPs at the time. They said, you guys have consistently done very well. And they said, you're keeping your expenses down and repaying the fees. And I was thinking about it, and they said, we'd like to give you more incentive to do even better as you get a larger firm. So they moved our carry from 25 to 30 points. And I was thinking, I looked around the room and I said, everybody's leading a reasonably good life. We don't need that extra 5 points. So why don't we then it evolved into, I think, let's take that extra 5 points and putting it in the management company. So that 16 2/3% now makes the management company the largest individual general partner. And so that took, the old days where everybody would be there and as long as they could be and all that sort of thing, it changed it completely. And so now we recognize that there's a layer above the general partner layer where the people who really want to make a career of this long term and they've passed whatever thresholds that it needs to be passed, that you can make this into a long-term career. You can build that into the management company. And then the twist on this is the one that Bill Draper is a director of, twist on this is that when you stop being a general partner, then your equity in the management company pivots to debt. So then that opens up new people to come in all the time. You have a dynamic sharing of the ownership of the management company. And it behooves everybody to be the best you can be on the field at the time it happens. And I think that it's very difficult to do in our business, but I would urge people to think that way because it's a long-term point of view. And again, it's a coalition of goals that gets you into that way of looking at life. And I think it dynamically fuels the engine.
So let me ask you, I mean, that's really interesting, actually. I want to come at your point from a slightly different angle, really looking at it from the eyes of the LPs. This sort of split, you get to a point where, at the end of the day, you know, the coastal or whomever wants to move on. And what are the LPs thinking about when they hear about that?
Well, they want to make sure that both the access to deal flow and the decision making about that deal flow will be as strong as it was before any particular individual left. And so, you know, you need it to be a partnership culture. So, you know, too much can become a superstar culture. And the LPs, if you have a superstar culture, then the LPs are like, well, X is leaving, so there goes A-Rod, and
there goes the fun.
There goes the fun. At First Round, we've been really strong on building a partnership culture where both the companies that we invest in see all of the partners, and the LPs see all of the partners all the time. And so it's not well, that was a Howard company, that was a Josh company, that was a Rob company. That was a First Round company. And as long as we keep the culture going and continue to provide the results we've done, that they're going to stick with us from the LP point of view. But if it's a superstar culture, which some firms have had, and then, you know, Vinod leaves, and some people say, well, we'll back Vinod.
Does that apply with respect to the financial rewards as well? Because if you have again, a couple of my friends have left funds as younger partners because they were frustrated that the deals that were coming in were the ones they actually sourced, but they weren't really seeing the financial benefit of the deal on the exits.
Well, you've got to have, you know, Dick talked about being equal partners early on. Benchmark is equal partners. First Round isn't quite there yet, but we make sure that even the newest partners have significant enough stakes.
It helps to be a team player, and you know, it's impossible to really do well if you're not a team player, really, over multi-generations, that is. And I think that attitude is, I mean, it's an attitudinal situation. And, you know, there are obviously always going to be some people who stand out for various attributes and some who don't, but they are really, I mean, we have one partner who is the smartest partner we have, and there's no superstar attached to that person, but everybody internally knows that how it is. You have to be honest. I mean, there has to be a dynamic that's in place that isn't hierarchical, and in order to encourage the best ideas, the best people to come forward.
What happens when the partner who's no longer aligned, I'll say, decides to move on? We talked about what the LP's reaction is with respect to the legacy fund. What's the reaction of the LPs as that new partner decides to start his or her own fund? And are they going back to the same LPs? Because that's that person's world, or has been that person's world, or are they looking beyond that?
Well, if they've made it to the management company, we say goodbye, because they're going to leave all that on the table.
Right.
So we think twice about it. If they haven't made it to that, I think we'll have an open discussion and talk about the merits and demerits of what the objectives they might have, and see if it can possibly, you know, included in the entire dynamic of the partnership.
Again, just as we're running out of time, I want to throw in another question. The partner who sort of decides they want to move on just for personal reasons or whatever, and wants to pursue, you know, we talked about funds who are just, your fund, for example, focused in a first round in the U.S., but they want to do more global investing. So, you know, there's no ill will there, it's just a different way of thinking. Do those partners think, how do they interrelate with the corporates at all? Would they jump from your ship and go to a corporate? There's a lot of money there.
The corporates, not so much. I mean, you know, part of the problem is always raising a first fund is hard.
Yeah.
Very hard. There are so many, and many of the...
Even if you're an established player?
Even if you're an established player, and many of the LPs won't do first funds, right? So you're going to take 3, 4, 5 years of a friends and family fund before you'll get back to the LP base that a first round or an NEA or the big funds have. So I think we you know, if you're really going to leave, we wish you well, and you've, you know, given up a lot of incentives, obviously, as Dick points out, but you're not going to stop them. We have not had that happen at first round so far.
Actually, at NEA, we've never lost somebody who didn't think could do better someplace else. and just by open communication. Now, I stopped being a general partner in NEA 14 because, you know, I was getting to the age where it's a good time to stop being that. And so I set up a family office, which quickly evolved into a smaller fund. We call it Green Bay Ventures. That's where I was born. And I brought in 2 younger partners, and our first limited partner was NEA. So we actually collaborate with them because we don't have any of the same our limited partners now are all family organizations, and they all want to co-invest, and it's a much simpler way to do it. We have a small fund. We augment what NEA is doing. We don't compete with them. And the same is true with my younger partners, a very good friend of the Andreessen Horowitz group, and we work with them as well as work with Foundry and a couple of others. But we're very selective about it, and we're not trying to build a big thing all over again. But that attitude of coming in and being our first limited partner is the attitude we have at the firm.
And for me, with B Capital, it's a later stage fund. It's not going to do anything that competes with first round. In fact, it may do later stage investing in better first round companies.
Right. Really interesting. We're getting the signals here. This has been a fascinating conversation. I can go on for
we were
hour.
looking back. Howard and I were musing about this last night, and if you look at what has happened before, and I said that Warburg Pincus is a pretty good firm, but they evolved quickly into being a much larger entity actually to do private equity and everything. We've never made that threshold into private equity. We don't intend to. We find that the prospect of being in the venture business, no matter what size, is the idea. That's a problem we have to solve continuously. How do you stay relative to startups? And we've had over 1,000 exits over the course of time in both M&A and IPOs at NEA, and we're still out there doing close to startups, not so much. There are a couple of raw startups, but usually early stage.
Great conversation. I'm just a little shocked that you guys were drinking while I was stuck on a plane. But hey, whatever. Well, thanks again for coming in. Thanks for listening to us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.